The sun was a hammer, beating the dust of Redemption Gulch into a fine, choking powder. It coated the tongue, settled in the folds of worn fabric, and turned the vast, indifferent sky into a dome of shimmering brass. An stood in the sliver of shade offered by the assayer's office, her body a study in stillness while the town churned around her with the noise of commerce and desperation. She held herself rigid, a discipline learned over 1,000 miles of ocean and another 1,000 of unforgiving land. To slump was to admit defeat, and defeat was a grave she was not yet ready to occupy. In the pocket of her faded light brown prairie dress, her fingers traced the smooth, cool surface of a single flat river stone, a useless weight she carried for the memory of water. She had been observing the men for hours, the loud ones, their laughter brittle and their boasts hollow, the quiet ones, their eyes constantly moving, calculating angles of threat and opportunity. And then there was him. He stood near the livery, not speaking to anyone, his attention fixed on the far-off mountains that shimmered like bruises on the horizon. He was tall, built of long, hard lines, with a face that seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape he surveyed. His clothes were plain, patched at the elbow and knee, his hat stained with sweat and sun. He looked poor. Not desperate like the others, but settled into his poverty, as if it were a coat he had long grown accustomed to wearing. He was a man who expected nothing. It was this quality that drew her eye, a stillness that mirrored her own. For 2 days she had offered her services at the town's only eatery, a greasy establishment that smelled of stale beer and regret. The proprietor, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, had laughed. He already had a cook, and he didn't need a slip of a girl from a faraway land cluttering his kitchen. Her savings, a pitiful collection of coins sewn into the hem of her dress, were nearly gone. Hunger was beginning to fray the edges of her composure. She watched the quiet man turn from the mountains and walk toward the general store. His stride was long and unhurried, the walk of someone who owned his time, even if he owned nothing else. An pushed herself away from the wall. The movement was a decision, a final cast of the dice. She intercepted him not by stepping into his path, but by appearing at his side as he paused before the store's dusty window, her reflection a pale ghost next to his solid frame. He did not startle. He simply turned his head, his gaze, a clear, startling gray like a winter sky, falling upon her. His eyes held no judgment, no pity, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. He saw the frayed collar of her dress, the disciplined set of her jaw, the exhaustion she could not quite hide. An swallowed the dust in her throat. Her voice, when it came, was low and rough with disuse. "I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook." The declaration hung in the oppressive heat between them. It was everything she had to offer. Not a plea, but a statement of fact. A single, polished skill offered up against the crushing indifference of the world. She met his gaze without flinching, her own dark eyes holding a history he could never guess. She had cooked for mandarins in shaded courtyards and for starving railroad gangs under the lash of the sun. She could make a feast from a handful of beans and a bitter root, could draw flavor from dust and hope. The man, Finian Ross, considered her. He looked at her hands, small but chapped, the nails clean. He looked at her eyes again and saw not the fragility of her frame, but the iron resolve behind it. He had seen that look before, in cornered animals and in men who had survived things they should not have. He needed someone for the cabin, someone quiet, someone who would not ask questions. The last one, a boy from back east, had lasted 4 days before the silence and the hardtack broke him. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, the gesture economical and final. "You're hired." He did not ask her name. He did not ask her price. He simply turned and entered the store. An Lee remained on the boardwalk, the sun beating down on her head, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She did not know if she had found salvation or simply a slower way to perish. When he emerged, he carried a sack of flour and another of beans, a slab of salt pork wrapped in butcher's paper, and a small tin of coffee. He handed none of it to her. He carried it all himself, his movements efficient and strong. "My place is a half-day's walk," he said, his voice as spare as the landscape. "Keep up." He set off, not looking back to see if she followed. An Lee took a deep breath, the air searing her lungs, and fell into step behind him. The noise of Redemption Gulch faded, replaced by the crunch of their boots on the dry, cracked earth and the immense, ringing silence of the high desert. The endurance test had already begun. The cabin was an insult to the trees that had been felled to build it. It squatted in a shallow, sun-baked bowl of land, a collection of poorly joined logs chinked with dried mud that was crumbling back to dust. The roof sagged in the middle, a sway-backed nag of a structure. A stone chimney listed to one side, threatening to collapse. There was no barn, no corral, only a rickety lean-to where a single rangy horse stood flicking its tail at flies. A shallow, hand-dug well with a frayed rope and a leaky bucket completed the picture of abject failure. This was not a ranch. It was a testament to poverty, a place where hope came to die. Finian dropped the sacks on the porch without ceremony. "Kitchen's inside. Water's low. Don't waste it." He walked away toward a line of broken fence posts that stretched toward a barren ridge, a hammer already in his hand. He did not give her a tour, offered no further instruction. He simply expected her to understand her role. An Lee watched him go, his back a rigid line of purpose against the vast emptiness. He was mending a fence that seemed to enclose nothing of value, a pointless act of labor in a world defined by its lack. She stepped inside. The cabin was a single room, dark and smelling of stale wood smoke and solitude. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. A narrow cot with a thin, patched blanket was pushed against one wall. On the other side was the hearth, a collection of crude iron pots and a single blackened skillet hanging from nails. A set of shelves held a few tin plates, a chipped enamel cup, and a small, nearly empty canister of salt. It was worse than she had imagined. Her first act was not to cook, but to clean. She found a worn broom and swept the packed earth floor, raising a cloud of dust that danced in the single shaft of light from the cabin's lone window. She took a rag and scrubbed the table, her movements methodical and sure. This was her space now, her domain. She would bring order to it. The well water was, as he'd said, low. The bucket came up half full of cloudy, lukewarm liquid. She tasted it. It was flat, heavy with minerals. Not good. She set it aside for washing and took one of the empty water skins from a peg by the door. She did not know this land, but she knew the logic of water. It flows downhill. It seeks low places. It sustains green things. Leaving the cabin, she ignored the barren bowl and walked toward the ridge Finian was working on, but angled away from him, her eyes scanning the ground. She looked for the darker soil, for the line of hardy brush that grew just a little thicker than the rest. It took her nearly an hour, her skin prickling under the relentless sun, but she found it. Tucked into a crevice between 2 large boulders, hidden by a tangle of thorny bushes, was a seep. A slow, steady drip of water, cool and clear, emerged from the rock face, pooling in a small, stone-lined basin, no bigger than a dinner plate. It was a miracle, a secret the land had kept. She filled the water skin, her heart lifting with a feeling she hadn't realized she'd lost, a small, fierce flicker of possibility. When she returned, Finian was still at the fence line, the rhythmic thump of his hammer the only sound in the vast quiet. He did not seem to notice her departure or her return. She set to work. She sifted the flour, her fingers finding and discarding the weevils. She sliced the salt pork into thin, precise strips. Using the precious, clean water from the seep, she made a simple dough for flatbreads. The fire in the hearth was reluctant, the wood dry and punky, but she coaxed it to life, her patience unwavering. By the time the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a meal was ready. It was not a feast. Salt pork fried until crisp, beans simmered for hours with a sliver of pork fat until they were creamy and rich, flatbreads blistered and hot from the skillet, and coffee boiled strong and black. The smell filled the small cabin, a scent of civilization and comfort that seemed alien in this desolate place. Finian entered as dusk settled, his face grimed with sweat and dust, his hands raw. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes taking in the scene. The swept floor, the clean table set with 2 plates, the food, simple but fragrant, waiting by the hearth. He looked at her, then at the nearly full water bucket by the door, then back at her. A question formed in his gray eyes, but he did not ask it. He moved to the wash basin, poured a little of the well water into it, and scrubbed his hands and face clean. He sat at the table. An Lee served him a plate, then filled her own, taking a seat opposite him. They ate in silence. The silence was different now. Before, it had been empty. Now, it was filled with the sounds of their meal, the scrape of a fork on a tin plate, the soft tearing of bread. Finian ate every last bean, wiped his plate clean with the final piece of flatbread, and drained his coffee cup. He pushed his stool back and stood. He looked at the meal, then at her. "The well," he said, his voice a low rumble. "How?" "Water has its own ways," An Lee replied, her voice soft. "You just have to know how to look." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave another of his small, sharp nods. He took a second blanket from a wooden chest in the corner, a blanket she hadn't noticed, thick and well made, and placed it on the floor near the hearth. It was her bed. It was an acknowledgment, an acceptance. He had tested her with hardship, and she had answered with competence and a quiet miracle. She had not complained. She had not despaired. She had found water in a wasteland. That night, An Lee lay on the blanket, listening to the man's steady breathing from the cot across the room. The fire died down to embers, and the immense, star-dusted silence of the desert pressed in. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like a ghost. She felt anchored. She was in the poorest place she had ever been, with a man who spoke in fragments and silences, and yet she felt a sliver of peace. She had been hired. She had a place. And she had her secrets, just as she suspected he had his. One of them, she noticed just before she drifted to sleep, was the knife he'd used to cut the salt pork. It wasn't a cheap, stamped blade like the rest of the utensils. The handle was worn smooth, but the steel held a razor edge, and it was balanced with the precision of a master craftsman. It was a telling detail, a single note of quality in a symphony of destitution. It did not belong here, and perhaps neither did he. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the earth. Finian would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and economical, and be gone to the fence line or to some other inscrutable task by the time the first light touched the ridge. An Lee would tend the fire, fetch the sweet water from the hidden seep, and prepare their meals. She expanded her domain. In a small, protected patch of earth behind the cabin, she started a garden, coaxing stubborn life from the dry soil, using the knowledge passed down from her grandmother. She planted a few of the dried beans from their supplies, hoping they would sprout. She found edible greens and bitter roots on her walks, things the land offered up to those who knew how to look, and incorporated them into their diet. Her cooking became a quiet conversation between them. A stew, richer than their ingredients should have allowed, was her way of saying, "We will endure." A perfectly baked piece of flatbread, light and airy, was a statement of care. Finian never commented, never offered praise, but he ate everything she put before him. His acknowledgment was a clean plate. His trust was in the unspoken permission for her to manage their dwindling supplies, to forage, to make this desolate place her own. One afternoon, a man on horseback appeared on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the glaring sky. He was not from Redemption Gulch. He was thick-set and wore clothes that were expensive but poorly kept. He rode down into the bowl as if he owned it, his horse a fine, powerful beast that was a stark contrast to Finian's scrawny animal. Finian, who had been reinforcing the sagging roof of the lean-to, stopped his work. He didn't reach for the rifle that was always propped just inside the cabin door. He simply stood, hammer in hand, and waited. His stillness was not passive. It was coiled, watchful. The man reined in his horse, kicking up a cloud of dust. He surveyed the pathetic cabin, the broken fences, and his lip curled in a sneer. His eyes fell on An Lee, who stood in the cabin doorway, and his expression shifted to one of leering appraisal. "Barlow," the man said, his voice carrying an easy arrogance. "This here's my territory. Seems you're squatting on it, Ross." "Got papers," Finian said, his voice flat. Barlow laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Papers can burn. This is poor land for a poor man. I'm feeling generous. I'll give you $50 for your claim. Take it and be gone by morning." He looked past Finian to An Lee again. "Or you can leave the girl. Call it 100. Finian's grip tightened on the hammer, his knuckles white, but his voice remained level, dangerously calm. "This is my land. I'm not selling." "Everything's for sale, Ross," Barlow sneered. "Especially for a man like you. You're starving out here. Look at this place. It's a grave you haven't finished digging." He spat on the ground. "I'll be back in 2 days, with my men. Either you're gone, or we'll make you gone. Your choice." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a pall of dust and threat hanging in the air. The silence he left behind was heavier, more menacing than before. An Lee looked at Finian. His face was a mask of stone, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the cold fire in his gray eyes. She saw a man pushed to a limit. She expected him to tell her to pack her things, to flee back to town. It was the sensible thing to do. This was not a fight he could win. He was one man, with a miserable cabin and a broken fence. Barlow had men and money. Instead, Finian went back to the lean-to and began hammering again, his strikes harder now, more violent. He worked until full dark, long after he could properly see. When he finally came inside, An Lee had the meal ready. She had used the last of the salt pork. It felt like a final communion. They ate, the silence between them thick with unspoken fear. After the meal, Finian cleaned his rifle. The motions were practiced, fluid. He did not speak of Barlow. He did not speak of leaving. He was preparing for a siege. An Lee watched him, her heart a cold knot in her chest. She had run from so much in her life, from famine, from war, from the men who saw her as property. She was tired of running. "I can help," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Finian stopped his work and looked at her. He saw no fear in her eyes, only the same steady resolve she'd shown the day he hired her. He had brought her to this place of hardship to test her, to see if she would break. He had not intended to bring her into a place of violence. "Stay inside," was all he said. It was not a dismissal. It was a command meant to protect. Anli understood the difference. She gave a single nod. Her fight would be within these walls. She spent the next day preparing. She filled every container with water from the seep. She baked all the remaining flour into hard, dense biscuits that would keep. She was fortifying her own small kingdom. On the second day, as the afternoon sun reached its zenith, they came. Barlow and 4 other men, all armed, their faces hard and cruel. They rode into the bowl and fanned out, their confidence absolute. "Last chance, Ross," Barlow yelled. Finian stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He looked small and alone against the vast landscape. "Last chance for you to leave my land." Barlow laughed and gave a signal. One of his men dismounted, a lit torch in his hand. The brush around the cabin was tinder dry. A fire would devour the place in minutes. Anli's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched from the window as the man ran toward the side of the cabin. But Finian had not been idle for 2 days. He had been observing, preparing. He had not been just mending fences. He had been setting his own. As the man with the torch ran, his foot caught on something, a thin, taut wire strung just above the ground. He pitched forward, the torch flying from his hand and extinguishing in the dust. In that moment of confusion, Finian raised his rifle, not with a gunslinger's flash, but with the calm precision of a seasoned hunter. A single shot cracked through the air. It did not hit a man. It hit the canteen on another rider's saddle, the metal exploding in a spray of precious water. It was a warning, a statement of capability that was more terrifying than a killing shot. Barlow's face contorted with rage. "Get him!" The men charged, firing wildly. Splinters flew from the cabin's log walls. Anli threw herself to the floor, the sound of the gunshots deafening in the small space. Finian had already moved, disappearing from the porch. There was another shot, from an impossible angle, coming from the rocks near the lean-to. One of the horses screamed and fell, trapping its rider's leg. He was using the land. The desolate, worthless bowl was his ally. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain. He was a ghost, firing and moving, never where they expected him to be. It was not a fair fight. It was a rout. Barlow, his face pale with shock and fury, realized his mistake. He had not cornered a desperate farmer. He had kicked a hornet's nest. He screamed at his remaining men to retreat. As they scrambled to flee, Finian appeared on the ridge above them, a commanding figure against the sky. He did not fire again. He simply watched them go, his message clear. "This is my land. You are not welcome here." The silence that returned was absolute, broken only by the whimpers of the man trapped under his horse. Finian walked down to him, his rifle held at his side. He helped the man get free, his movements devoid of anger. He looked at the man's leg, saw it was broken. "Tell Barlow," Finian said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron, "that if he ever returns, I will not aim for his water." He helped the man onto another rider's horse, and they limped away, leaving their dead animal behind. The battle was over. Anli crept out of the cabin. The air smelled of gunpowder and fear. She saw Finian standing over the dead horse, his shoulders slumped. He looked tired, older than he had that morning. She went to him, her steps quiet on the dusty ground. He had a shallow gash on his forearm, a long splinter of wood embedded in the flesh where a bullet had struck the cabin wall near him. Blood dripped slowly onto the dust. Without a word, she took his arm. He did not resist. She led him inside to the table. She fetched the clean water from the seep and a strip of cloth she had torn from one of her few undergarments. Her hands were gentle but firm as she cleaned the wound, her touch methodical. With a pair of tweezers from her small sewing kit, she carefully, expertly, pulled the long splinter from his arm. He flinched but made no sound, his eyes fixed on her face. He was watching her, seeing her steadiness, her lack of panic. She had not screamed. She had not cried. She had prepared. She bound the wound tightly. Their hands touched, his calloused and grimed, hers small and steady. In that touch, a current passed between them, an understanding deeper than any words. He had protected this place. She had held its heart. He finally broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to show you something." He stood and walked to the door, pausing to see if she would follow. She did, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He led her not toward the road to town, but back, up toward the barren ridge he was always mending. The fence was not broken, she saw that now. It was perfect, strong, not meant to keep things in, but to keep people out. They reached the crest of the ridge. It was the threshold. Finian stopped and looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "What I did," he said, gesturing back toward the cabin. "The poverty. It was a test, to see who came to my door, to see what they were made of." He turned and gestured for her to look over the ridge. Anli stepped forward and drew in a sharp, silent breath. The sight stole the air from her lungs. Below them, stretching out as far as the eye could see, was a different world. A hidden valley, lush and green, cradled by the protective arms of the mountains. A wide, sparkling river snaked through emerald pastures where hundreds of cattle, fat and healthy, grazed peacefully. In the center of the valley, nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees, stood a house. It was not a cabin. It was a sprawling stone and timber ranch house, built with grace and strength, smoke curling gently from its massive chimney. There were barns, corrals, stables, a whole world of prosperity and life hidden just beyond the veil of the barren ridge. The desolate bowl was a gatehouse, a lie designed to filter the world. "My name is Finian Ross," he said, his voice quiet beside her. "My father built this place. He left it to me. He also left me with a warning, that wealth attracts vultures. So I live at the gate. I watch. I wait." Anli could not speak. She looked at the valley, a paradise earned and protected by hardship. She looked at the grand house, a home that promised comfort and security beyond her wildest dreams. Then she looked at him, at Finian, the man who wore poverty like armor, who ate her simple meals in silence, who had stood alone against 5 men to protect his home. The house didn't matter. The cattle didn't matter. The wealth was just scenery. The man beside her was the landscape she had come to know. His character was the solid ground beneath her feet. She thought of Barlow, who had seen only a poor squatter and an easy target. He had failed the test. She thought of herself, arriving with nothing but a skill and her integrity. She had been tested with scarcity, with silence, with fear. Finian watched her face, his own expression guarded, waiting. This was the final test, the revelation that could change everything. He expected awe, perhaps, or even a glimmer of avarice. He was prepared for it. But Anli's eyes, when they met his, held neither. They held a quiet, profound understanding. She finally understood the perfectly balanced knife, the well-made boots he wore, even as his shirt was patched, the tireless work on a fence that guarded an empire. It all made a terrible, beautiful sense. "The water from the seep," she said, her voice steady. "It is sweeter." It was a strange thing to say, looking down upon a river, but he understood her meaning completely. The water she had found, the small miracle she had earned through her own effort and observation, was of more value to her than the vast, easy river below. A slow smile touched Finian's lips for the first time. It transformed his harsh face, warming it like the dawn. The tension he had carried for years seemed to fall away from his shoulders. He had found someone who saw the truth not of his possessions, but of his spirit. Someone who had passed the test not by enduring his poverty, but by enriching it. "The house needs a cook," he said, his gaze holding hers. "The pay is good." It was an offer, a way out, a business transaction. But they both knew it was more than that. An Li looked from the grand house back to the miserable little cabin squatting in the dusty bowl. That was the place where she had found her footing. That was the place where she had been seen. "I am more than a cook," she replied softly, her words a quiet challenge. "I know," Finian said, his voice full of a feeling he had no other words for. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking to nothing. "This is my home. The valley, the house, even the cabin." He took her hand, his rough palm enveloping hers. "It is an empty place without the right person to share it. A house is not a home." He did not ask her to be his wife in a torrent of flowery words. He did not need to. His proposal was in the quiet offering of his entire world, the false and the true. It was in the trust he had finally given. An Li looked at their joined hands. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the endless miles of hardship and loneliness. She had been searching not for wealth, but for a place to stand, a place where her worth was measured by the strength of her character. She had found it here, in the heart of this quiet, complicated man. She squeezed his hand, a small, firm gesture of acceptance. "My name," she said, looking up into his winter-gray eyes, "is An Li." It was the first time she had offered it, an offering of herself to match his own. "An Li," he repeated, the name a soft prayer on his lips. "It is a good name." They stood on the ridge for a long time, watching the sun set over their valley, their home. The future was not a grand house or fields of cattle. It was a shared silence, a quiet understanding, and the promise of a life to be built together, founded on the hard, true ground of what they had survived.